The rhythmic clatter of the train against the tracks was almost hypnotic, lulling Daniel into a state of drowsiness. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a few silent passengers scattered among the dimly lit seats. It was well past midnight, and the thick darkness outside turned the window into a mirror. His own reflection stared back at him, eyes drooping, head bobbing as sleep crept over him like a slow-moving tide. He wasn't even sure when he fully drifted off, only that the sensation of icy breath against the back of his neck pulled him violently from his slumber. His eyes snapped open, heart hammering. A chill spread down his spine as he sat motionless, his breath shallow. The overhead lights flickered, casting jittery shadows along the length of the carriage. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the empty aisle behind him. No one was there. And yet, he could feel it, the undeniable presence of something looming inches away. His fingers tightened around the armrests. He swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling, to convince himself that it was just a lingering dream. The breath on his neck came again, freezing, unnatural. His entire body tensed as a hoarse whisper, just barely audible, hissed into his ear. "Don't turn around." Daniel's blood ran cold. He clenched his jaw, every instinct screaming at him to run, to flee, but his muscles refused to obey. The train jolted suddenly, the lights flickering wildly before stabilizing. And for a brief moment, he swore he saw a shadow move across the aisle in his peripheral vision. The whispering returned, garbled now, like a distorted radio signal filled with static and faint, ghastly laughter. Slowly, he reached for his phone in his jacket pocket, fingers trembling. The screen illuminated as he lifted it, using its reflection to see behind him. Nothing. The seat was empty. He exhaled shakily, but the relief was fleeting. As he angled the phone slightly, his breath hitched. The reflection showed the row behind him occupied. A figure sat directly behind him, draped in ragged black fabric, its face a void of shadow. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Yet the weight of its presence pressed against his shoulders like an unbearable force. The train lurched again, the lights blinking off completely for a split second. When they flickered back on, his phone slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. He bit down on a cry, unwilling to make a sound, unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. A cold, skeletal hand slid over his shoulder. Daniel bolted from his seat, nearly toppling into the aisle. He spun around, empty. His seat, the seat behind him, the entire row completely void of any occupants. His phone lay face up on the floor, its screen cracked. The sense of dread only deepened as he slowly crouched to retrieve it. A single notification blinked on the shattered screen. "You shouldn't have turned around." His hand shook as he gripped the device. The train screeched as if hitting a curve too sharply, the overhead compartments rattling. The remaining passengers remained silent, statues in their seats, unmoving. Something was wrong. Swallowing hard, Daniel staggered down the aisle, gripping onto the backs of seats for stability. The train rocked harder, the dim bulbs overhead flickering erratically. As he passed each row, he noticed something chilling. Each passenger he approached had their heads tilted at an unnatural angle, their eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His breathing became ragged. He reached out to shake a nearby man's shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed the fabric of the man's coat, the figure collapsed like an empty shell, a lifeless husk that crumpled into itself. Daniel stumbled back with a strangled gasp, his foot kicking against something solid. He looked down. It was his own body, sprawled lifelessly in the aisle, face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The train shuddered violently, and the overhead lights flared a deep, bloody red. The windows turned pitch black, reflecting nothing. A static hum filled the carriage, growing louder, more deafening with every second. Daniel backed away from his own corpse, chest heaving, as shadows coiled around him like grasping fingers. To feel against his ear, "You should have stayed asleep." Then, darkness swallowed him whole. The train continued on, rattling down the endless tracks, its passengers silent, unmoving, forever locked in their midnight journey. at exactly 11:45 p.m., its headlights slicing through the thick mist. The platform was nearly deserted except for me and the old conductor, who stood beside the train door, his uniform slightly disheveled, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap. As I stepped forward to board, he lifted a hand to stop me. "Listen," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "If someone boards after midnight, do not look him in the face." I hesitated. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, gaze flickering toward the empty tracks. "Just keep your eyes down, no matter what you hear, no matter what you feel. Got it?" A strange chill ran through me, but I nodded. The conductor exhaled, seemingly satisfied, and stepped aside. The doors hissed open, and I entered the train. The interior was dimly lit, its long rows of seats mostly unoccupied. A few scattered passengers sat motionless, their heads tilted down as if asleep. The air smelled faintly of old leather and something metallic, something I couldn't quite place. I settled into a window seat, watching the station slowly slide away as the train lurched forward. Outside, the darkness swallowed the landscape whole. There were no city lights, no scattered houses, just an endless black void stretching in every direction. The first hour passed uneventfully. The only sound, the rhythmic clatter of the train against the tracks. But at precisely 12:01 a.m., the overhead lights flickered. The train shuddered violently, as if something massive had slammed against its side. The passengers around me remained still, eerily unbothered. Then, from the far end of the car, I heard the slow, deliberate click of the train door opening. My blood turned to ice. Someone had boarded. I kept my eyes fixed on my lap, heart hammering. Footsteps echoed through the carriage's low, heavy, dragging. They passed by me, carrying a scent of damp earth and something rotten. My throat tightened as the thing moved closer, stopping just inches from my seat. I could feel its presence, its weight pressing against the air. A whisper, hollow and guttural, slid into my ear. "Look at me." My hands clenched into fists. The urge to glance up, to confirm what stood before me, gnawed at my mind like a parasite, but I held still. The thing exhaled, a sound like wind rushing through dead trees. Then, from somewhere down the car, another voice whimpered. "Oh God, oh no." A wet, choking sound cut them off. A sickening thud followed. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't need to see it to know someone had looked. The air grew impossibly heavy, and the smell of decay thickened. A faint scratching sound started behind me, like nails skittering against the window. A distorted reflection flickered in the glass, something too tall, too twisted, shifting and watching. My breath came in shallow gasps as the train pressed forward, the weight of unseen eyes burrowing into my skin. Time stretched and warped. At some point, the lights flickered again, and the heavy presence moved away. The dragging footsteps receded, another train door creaked open, and just like that, the weight lifted. The train rumbled on. I forced myself to open my eyes. The passengers remained eerily still, but a single empty seat sat drenched in something dark and glistening. A discarded shoe lay nearby, its owner gone. The train showed no signs of stopping. I gripped the armrest, my stomach twisting into knots. Then the voice returned, a whisper brushing against my skin from just inches away. "Next time, you will look." The train plunged deeper into the endless night. Hours passed. The train never slowed, never approached another station. Outside the window, the darkness remained absolute, swallowing the world beyond the tracks. Panic clawed at my chest. Where were we going? How long had we been traveling? The other passengers remained eerily silent. I tried to shift my gaze, to see their faces without actually looking at them. Their posture was unnatural stiff, as though they weren't breathing. At 2:47 a.m., the lights flickered again. The train shuddered to a halt. Something was outside. The doors hissed open, and a rush of frigid air swept through the carriage. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from the corridor beyond. It was slow, deliberate. The air thickened with something foul, a mixture of mildew and rotting flesh. I clutched the edge of my seat, forcing myself to remain still. The tapping grew louder, closer. It was inside now. I felt it pass behind me. its breath raking across the back of my neck. My body screamed to move, to run, but I didn't dare. The thing settled in the seat across from me. I could feel it staring, waiting. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then, slowly, the presence shifted. A gurgling noise filled the cabin, a grotesque symphony of wet, ragged breathing. Another passenger sobbed softly. Then came the worst part. Down. The touch lingered for a moment before withdrawing. The whisper returned, so close that it felt like it came from within my own skull. Not yet. The train jolted forward, the air clearing just slightly. The foul presence withdrew, slithering back down the car. Another door opened and shut. I exhaled, my whole body trembling. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at my lap, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to survive another night on this train. The train rumbled through the night, a lone serpent slithering along the steel rails. It was the last train of the evening, a near-empty commuter ride through the countryside. The passengers were few scattered across the dimly lit carriages, each lost in their own world. A businessman tapped at his phone. A young woman dozed against the window. An elderly couple murmured in hushed tones, and a teenager bobbed his head to music that hissed from his oversized headphones. Then came the tunnel. A yawning void swallowed the train whole, and as it did, the overhead lights flickered and died. The passengers barely had time to register the sudden blackout before the sound began. Heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly loud against the rattling of the train. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud moved down the aisle, closer, pausing near each seat as if inspecting the occupants. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe. The darkness was thick and absolute, a void where sight was useless, leaving only sound and sensation. A cold draft whispered through the carriage, carrying a scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like rust or old blood. The footsteps stopped. A long, excruciating silence followed. The darkness stretched, pressing against their nerves. Someone shifted uncomfortably, and a seat creaked softly. Then, with a violent sputter, the lights flared back to life. Every passenger whipped their gaze around, searching, scanning. And there he was. Seated by the window near the middle of the carriage was a man who had not been there before. He was dressed in a crisp black suit, hands resting in his lap. But his face's face was not a face at all. It was smooth, white, featureless like polished porcelain, stretched over bone. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just an empty, expressionless expanse of skin. A strangled gasp broke the silence. Someone near the front of the carriage stifled a cry. The businessman dropped his phone, the clatter echoing down the tunnel walls. The faceless man did not move. Mannequin that breathed. Then the train lurched. The wheels screeched as the carriage shuddered violently. The lights flickered again, plunging everything into chaos. A woman shrieked. Something thudded to the floor. A body? The lights returned, weaker now, flickering in and out. The faceless man was no longer seated. Rise. No one had seen him move. Yet there he was, closer, more imposing. His presence seemed to distort the air around him, warping the space, making the walls of the carriage feel impossibly narrow. A wet choking sound came from the back of the train. The elderly couple both slumped forward, heads lolling, a dark stain spreading across their clothing. The businessman staggered to his feet, his breath ragged, his gaze darting from the faceless man to the collapsing passengers. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand answers, to scream, but no sound came out. His lips moved uselessly, his throat convulsed, straining. It was as if his voice had been stolen. The teenager clawed at the emergency stop lever, but the train did not slow. The young woman pounded on the window, but the outside world was a swirling abyss, the tunnel stretching impossibly long, as though they would never emerge. Time unraveled. The carriage filled with whisper sibilant, unintelligible voices slithering into their ears, winding into their minds. The faceless man had not moved again, but the air pulsed with his presence. One final time, darkness, Silence. A sudden, suffocating void. A breath soft closer right beside each of them. And then, light. The train burst from the tunnel into the night. The glow of the station visible ahead. The passengers blinked against the harsh illumination, gasping, scrambling to take in their surroundings. The faceless man was gone. The elderly couple was gone. Their seats were empty, as though they had never been there at all. The businessman collapsed into his seat, clutching his throat, sobbing silently. The teenager's hands trembled on the emergency lever, his face drained of color. The young woman still pressed against the window, her eyes wild, unseeing. The train rolled into the station and came to a smooth stop. The doors hissed open. No one moved. Outside, the platform was empty. The station clock read the same time as when they had first entered the tunnel. No minutes had passed. No time had moved. The speakers crackled to life. Final stop. All passengers, please disembark. One by one, the survivors stumbled out onto the platform. They turned back, staring into the empty carriage, half expecting to see him still seated by the window. The doors slid shut. The train hummed. The lights inside flickered. And in the window's reflection, just for a moment smooth, white skin stared back at them. Then the train was gone. The train rumbled down the tracks, slicing through the thick fog that clung to the earth like a suffocating shroud. Jacob sat alone in a dimly lit carriage, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. The other passengers were either asleep or hidden behind the high-backed seats, their presence marked only by an occasional cough or rustling of fabric. He glanced at his watch, 12:07 a.m. He'd caught the last train home, exhausted after a long shift at the factory. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks had a hypnotic effect, but something about the journey felt wrong. It wasn't just the eerie stillness or the oppressive weight in the air, it was the overwhelming sensation that someone or something was watching him. Jacob rubbed his eyes and stared out the window, but the landscape was nothing more than an inky void. He caught his own reflection in the glass of pale face, tired eyes, but just as he was about to turn away, he saw movement. A shape, distorted and shifting, loomed behind him. He spun around, his pulse hammering in his throat. The carriage was empty. A cold breath of air curled around his neck. The temperature had dropped. He exhaled, and a puff of mist escaped his lips. The train had heating, it shouldn't be this cold. A loud bang echoed from the far end of the carriage. Jacob jumped. It sounded like someone had slammed a door. He scanned the rows of seats but saw nothing. Then the lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the train into near darkness. When they stabilized, he saw a man standing in the aisle, several rows ahead. Jacob's blood turned to ice. The man was facing away, unmoving. He wore an old-fashioned suit, slightly tattered at the cuffs. His presence was utterly silent, no sound of breathing, no shuffling of feet. Then, slowly, agonizingly slow, the man turned his head, but only his head. Jacob's stomach clenched. The man's face was wrong. His eyes were impossibly black. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, too wide for a human face. The lights flickered again. When they came back on, the man was gone. Jacob scrambled to his feet, his instincts screaming at him to get off the train. But how? They were still moving. He rushed toward the nearest door and tried the emergency handle. It didn't budge. Then the train slowed. Not at a station, there was no announcement, no platform outside. It came to a jerky stop in the middle of nowhere. The silence that followed was deafening. No voices, no conductor, no explanation. A whisper skittered through the air, brushing past Jacob's ear like a spider's legs. "You shouldn't be here." His breath hitched. He spun around, but the carriage was empty except for something moving between the seats. It slithered, shadowy and boneless, weaving toward him. He stumbled backward, his heart thundering. The thing rose, forming a shapino, a person. It was himself. Jacob gaped at his own doppelganger, standing just a few feet away, mirroring his every movement. Its eyes, however, were dead, black pits of nothingness. Then it smiled his own smile, but stretched and monstrous. "Come closer," it whispered in his voice. Jacob bolted. He crashed through the doors into the next carriage. This one was different. The seats were old, dusty, as if abandoned for decades. The air reeked of decay. Then he saw them, the passengers. Rows of people sat in eerie stillness, their heads bowed, their skin pale and lifeless. Their mouths hung open, as though frozen mid-scream. And then, one by one, their heads turned toward him in unison, empty eyes locking onto his. A shrill screech rang through the train, and the lights failed completely. In the pitch black, something grabbed Jacob's arm. Cold, bony fingers dug into his skin. He thrashed, kicking wildly, but the grip tightened. A voice, guttural and ancient, whispered into his ear, "Stay with us." Jacob tore free and sprinted back to his carriage. The moment he crossed the threshold, the lights returned. The train was moving again, as if nothing had happened. The seats were normal. No dust, no lifeless passengers, no doppelganger. He collapsed into his seat, gasping for breath. The train rolled into a station. Without hesitation, he leaped to his feet and rushed out the doors. As he stepped onto the platform, he risked one final glance at the train. Through the window, he saw his own reflection. It didn't move. Jacob stood frozen on the platform, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The train's doors slid shut, and it began to pull away, the fog swallowing it within seconds. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in short gasps. Was it real? Or had exhaustion finally cracked his mind? A cold breeze slithered down his spine. He turned around to leave, but the platform was empty, too empty. The station, usually dimly lit, was almost pitch black. The streetlights outside flickered weakly, barely illuminating the deserted sidewalk. His car was just across the lot, but suddenly the distance felt insurmountable. Footsteps echoed behind him. No one was there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. His throat constricted. Then something brushed against his arm. A voice, distorted and hollow, whispered, "You never got off." Panic surged through Jacob as he bolted across the lot, fumbling for his keys. He reached his car, yanked open the door, and threw himself inside. He jammed the key into the ignition. Refused to start. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw himself sitting in the back seat. The train lurched forward with a groan, the engine's hum vibrating through the dimly lit carriage. Jessica settled into her seat, pulling her coat tighter around her. Outside, the world was swallowed by darkness, the occasional flicker of distant lights barely piercing the vast emptiness of the countryside. This was the last train of the night, and she was one of only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the car. The air felt stale, tinged with the faint metallic scent of old rail tracks, and something else, something sour, almost rancid. She glanced around. A businessman a few rows ahead, tapping furiously on his laptop. A woman cradling a sleeping child near the back. An old man staring blankly out the window, unmoving. And then there was him. The man sat diagonally across from Jessica, his seat angled just enough that he could watch her without being obvious about it. His eyes were pale and wide, his expression empty, almost expectant. His suit was slightly wrinkled, the tie just a bit too loose. Something about him made her stomach twist. She forced herself to look away, gazing instead at the reflection in the window. But his eyes met hers there too. A shiver danced down her spine. She reached into her bag, gripping her phone like a lifeline. No signal, of course. The countryside was notorious for dead zones, and this train, old and rattling, felt like a relic from another time. The lights overhead flickered just for a second. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The hum of the engine grew louder, then softer, then loud again, as though the train was breathing. Then came the sound. It was subtle at first, a faint clicking, like someone tapping their nails against glass. She turned her head slowly, trying to locate the source. It was behind her. Click, click, click. Her pulse quickened. The woman with the child hadn't moved. The businessman was still typing. The old man remained frozen, eyes fixed on the nothingness outside. Yet the sound persisted. Click, click, click. Jessica hesitated, then twisted in her seat, peering over the backrest. The last few rows of the train were cloaked in shadow, the light too dim to make out anything clearly. And then she saw it. A figure crouched on the floor, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Long fingers tapped rhythmically against the metal paneling. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by a curtain of greasy, tangled hair. She jerked forward, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. When she glanced at the reflection in the window, the figure wasn't there, but she could still hear it. Click, click, click. Jessica forced herself to stay calm. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe the darkness was playing tricks on her. She dared another look. The seat behind her was empty. Her throat clenched. The sound was gone, but the silence felt heavier now, pressing against her skin like damp cloth. The train rocked violently as it rounded a bend, and the lights flickered again, longer this time. A static-like hiss filled the air, creeping into her ears. The businessman stopped typing. The woman with the child went rigid. Even the old man stirred, his fingers twitching against the armrest. And then, all at once, the lights went out. Jessica gasped, gripping the edge of her seat. The darkness was thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The train continued its relentless journey forward, the wheels clanking against the tracks, but everything else was silent. No murmurs, no rustling of fabric, no breathing. Then, a whisper, right beside her ear. "You shouldn't be here." She bolted upright, her scream strangled in her throat. The lights surged back to life, too bright, too white. She whipped her head around. The seats were empty. All of them. Her stomach twisted into knots. The businessman, the mother, the old man, they were gone. Only the pale-eyed man remained, still staring, still expectant. A slow, thin smile crept across his face. The train shuddered violently, the windows rattling. Outside, the landscape had changed. The countryside was gone, replaced by something else, an endless void, a swirling abyss of black and red, shapes shifting within it. Twisted, grotesque figures pressing against the glass, their faces warped in silent screams. Jessica scrambled to her feet, heart hammering against her ribs. The door to the next carriage loomed ahead. She sprinted toward it, fingers clawing at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Her reflection in the window twisted, eyes hollow, mouth stretched into a scream she hadn't yet made. The train groaned, the metal beneath her feet vibrating with something deeper than motion, something alive. The pale-eyed man stood now, his movements slow, deliberate. "It's too late," he said softly. The lights flickered again, and in that brief darkness, something touched her shoulder. Cold, clawed. When the light returned, she wasn't on the train anymore. And the train rolled on, empty once more.